Hey everyone, this is chapter 2 of Matthias Küntzel's Nazis, Islamic Antisemitism in the Middle East, the 1948 Arab War against Israel and the Aftershocks of World War II. Chapter 2 of the book is titled 1937, The Watershed. This might be one of those videos where I have to break it in two, but I hopefully won't have to. It's not very long. But then again, I tend to look things up. European anti-Semitism made slow headway in the Arab world. The transformation of the Jewish adversaries of Muhammad from a minor annoyance into the incarnation of evil took time. The process was pioneered by members of the Christian minorities in the Ottoman Empire and European priests and diplomats who brought the ritual murder blood libel of the Christian Middle Ages to the Middle East. In 1840, the Damascus affair attracted international attention. Wikipedia says the Damascus affair of February 1840 was the disappearance of an Italian monk and his servant, for which a large number of Jews were summarily tortured until they, quote, confessed, unquote, to murder. As an instance of anti-Semitism and blood libel, news of the case spread across the Middle East to Europe and the Western world. The Christians were supported in their accusation by the French consul at Damascus, Ulysses de Ratimenton, a person described by historians as anti-Semitic and known to favor Christian merchants and advisors over their Jewish counterparts. Ratimenton, or Menton, ordered that an investigation be carried out in the Jewish quarter where both men had last been seen, and encouraged the Egyptian governor of Damascus to act upon the matter, which resulted in the accused being imprisoned and interrogated under torture, after which they confessed to the murder. Anti-Semitism increased, with Muslims and Christians alike becoming violent and attacking innocent Jewish people. This drew international attention, and European Jewry were horrified. Sir Moses Montefiore of Great Britain and Adolphe Crémieux of France were publicly outraged. In contrition, Muhammad Ali of Egypt released the remaining prisoners, but refused to acquit them. It was not until November 1840, after Egyptian withdrawal and the restoration of Ottoman Syria, and the Sultan Abdul Majid I decreed all charges should be lifted. Back to the text. Franciscan monks and the French consul accused Jews of murdering a member of the order and his attendant to obtain their bloods for use in the forthcoming Passover feast. The anti-Jewish riots that followed spread throughout the Ottoman Empire, always incited by Christians. Footnote: Yosef Bodansky, Islamic Antisemitism as a Political Instrument, published in 1999. And the description for this book says, anti-Semitism, that is, anti-Jewishness and anti-Judaism, is intensifying throughout the Muslim world. The significance of this virulent anti-Jewishness and anti-Judaism is in that this type The significance of this virulent anti-Jewishness and anti-Judaism is in that this type of anti-Semitism goes beyond the hatred it espouses. In the contemporary Muslim world, anti-Jewishness and anti-Judaism constitute a major political instrument in the hands of both state governments and Islamist terrorist organizations to mobilize the entire region for the destruction of Israel, irrespective of diplomatic treaties, including the current peace process. Back to the text and footnote. Some decades later, the upsurge of anti-Semitism that accompanied the guilty verdict against the French army officer Alfred Dreyfus in 1894 was reflected in the French sphere of influence in the Maghreb. Thus, in 1898, French colonists in Tunis organized an anti-Semitic demonstration under the slogan, quote, "Down with Zola," end quote, and, quote, "Down with the Jews," end quote. Footnote, see Mohsen Hamdi, Anti-Semitism in Tunisia, 1881 to 1961. The description of this book says, the phenomenon of anti-Semitism in Tunisia, as respected Jewish and Muslim historians indicate, was alien to the Tunisian society before the arrival of the French in 1881. What I call the French, quote, protectorate crisis, end quote, not only undermined the relative autonomy the Jews had always enjoyed, but also established an unprecedented concept called, quote, Jewish element, end quote, indigenous Muslims and French settlers were taught to circumvent. Determined to, quote, contain, end quote, what they considered a, quote, Jewish peril, end quote, the French alienated those already naturalized French, parenthesis, the educated elite and the rich grana who were won over, end parenthesis, and sowed discord in all its forms between the, quote, unwanted and, quote, proletariat Jews and their Muslim compatriots. This book discusses the protectorate crisis in Tunisia and the ordeal of the Jews, the French complicity in the 1917 to 1918 anti-Jewish riots, and the post-World War II anti-Semitist current, the 1940 to 43 Jewish victims in Tunisia, and the French imbroglio, the 1948 controversy over the accession of Jews to the Kedal Corps, and how independent Tunisia, quote, othered, end quote, Jews. Back to the text and footnote. However, in the Maghreb, the Jews had to contend not only with excited Christian settlers from France, but also with Muslims who interpreted the Jews' progressive liberation from dhimmi status as a plot against Islam and despised them as profiteers from colonialism. Algerian Jews, unlike Muslims, were allowed to become French citizens and were therefore viewed as agents of the colonial power and hated as such by sections of the Muslim population. In addition, anti-Semitic works of European provenance were now translated into Arabic, among them an Arabic edition published in Cairo in 1899 of August Rolling's agitational pamphlet, The Talmud Jew. Wikipedia says August Rolling lived from 1839 to 1931 and was a German Catholic theologian, student of anti-Semitic text, and polemical author. He studied at Munster and Paris and became professor successively at the University of Munster, Milwaukee, and Charles University in Prague, retiring in 1901. August Rolling wrote polemics against Protestantism and Judaism, Of his anti-Jewish works, Der Talmud Juda, 1871, became a standard work for anti-Semitic authors and journalists. Talmud Juda is a faulty abstract of the Entdecktes Judentum of Johann Andreas Eisenmenger. The Talmud Jew, the book, first appeared when Bismarck inaugurated his anti-Catholic legislation as a retort to the attacks made by liberal journalists on the dogma of papal infallibility and on Jesuitic textbooks. The book was extensively quoted by the Catholic press, but it did not become a political force until the appearance of anti-Semitism and Tis Eslar affair in 1883. Franz Delitzsch defended Judaism against the attacks of Rolling. At the same time, Joseph Samuel Bloch wrote articles in which he accused August Rolling of ignorance and of forgery of the text. August Rolling sued Bloch for libel but withdrew the suit at the last moment. Later on, Rolling greeted the appearance of Zionism as the solution of the Jewish question and wrote a pamphlet against Gudemann's article Das Judentum in seinen Grundzügen, etc. All right. And yeah, I can't find anything on that particular book. Anyway, in addition, anti-Semitic works of European provenance were now translated into Arabic, among them an Arabic edition published in Cairo in 1899 of August Rolling's agitational pamphlet, The Talmud Jew. Then in 1918 in Palestine, the first Arabic edition of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion appeared. Footnote: see the article by Boris Hevel, Haj Amin al-Husseini, Herald of a Religious Anti-Judaism in the Contemporary Islamic World, published in the Journal of the Middle East and Africa, Volume 5, Number 3, 2014. End footnote. Then in 1918, where am I? Okay. Shortly thereafter, in March 1921, the Palestine Arab Congress in Jerusalem sent the British colonial minister Winston Churchill a memorandum that clearly drew on this source. Quote, Jews have been among the most active promoters of destruction in many countries, end quote. It asserts, the quote, Jew is a Jew everywhere in the world. He supports wars whenever his own interests dictate, and thus uses the armies of the nations to do what he wishes, end quote. Footnote: the memorandum is available in Martin Gilbert, Winston S. Churchill, Volume 4, Companion Part 2, Documents 1919 to 1921, published in 1977. However, this type of anti-Semitism could not reach more than a tiny minority of Muslims, let alone convince them. Other means were needed in order to drum the idea of a Jewish world conspiracy into the heads of the illiterate masses of Muslims. Massive Muslims. Quote, the propagation of anti-Semitic themes, unquote, emphasizes Bernard Lewis, quote, was not left to chance, nor was it entirely entrusted to Middle Eastern enterprise. Anti-Semitism has been energetically propagated by various European groups. The most important in this century were the Nazis, who from the early 1930s until the defeat of Germany in 1945 devoted great efforts to the spread of anti-Semitic doctrines among the Arabs. End quote. Bernard Lewis, The Jews of Islam, published in 1984. This book published with Princeton University Press. The Jews of Islam by Bernard Lewis. The description says this landmark book probes Muslims' attitudes towards Jews and Judaism as a special case of their view of other religious minorities in predominantly Muslim societies. With authority, sympathy, and wit, Bernard Lewis demolishes two competing stereotypes: the Islamophobic picture of the fanatical Muslim warrior, sword in hand, and Quran in the other, and the overly romanticized depiction of Muslim societies as interfaith utopias. Featuring a new introduction by blah blah blah. This is just doesn't say anything about the book. It's just sales pitch. End footnote. In 1933, Hitler had met with an Egyptian journalist in 1936, who in 1936 would agree to translate Mein Kampf into Arabic. This project came to nothing, although in the same year Hitler himself had stated his agreement with, quote, refraining from a translation of those passages of which, in the light of the sensitivities of the Arab peoples, a translation does not seem suitable, end quote. Hitler. Footnote. Quoted from Klaus Michael Malmann and Martin Kupers Hauptmann und Hakenkreuz. Das Dritte Reich, die Araber und Palästina. Published in 2006. The description for this book says, this is the first comprehensive account of the relationship between Nazi Germany and the Arab Middle East. It illuminates a relationship that leaves ample room for conflict between racist ideology, politics, and religion, the extent of which has so far been largely ignored. Here's a better description, sorry. Oh, never mind, no, that's a review, sorry, never mind. Anyway, back to the text and footnote. This comment refers to a decidedly anti-Arab passage in the book in which Hitler talked about the, quote, racial inferiority of these so-called, quote, oppressed nations, end quote, and mocked the, quote, holy war, end quote, of the Muslims. It was only in June 1937 that Berlin first began to take a serious interest in the Arabs of Palestine. According to Eli Kedori, I don't know if I'm saying that, Eli Kedori, quote, the period 1937 to 39 may be considered a watershed in the somber, disaster-strewn history of the Palestinians, end quote. It was therefore no accident that the first document of Islamic Antisemitism, a pamphlet entitled Islam and Judaism, appeared in 1937 in Cairo against the background of events in Palestine in the summer of that year. Eli Kederi lived from 1926 to 1992 and was a British historian of the Middle East. Eli Kederi wrote from a perspective that dissented from many points of view taken as orthodox in the field. From 1953 to 1990, he taught at the London School of Economics, where Eli Kederi or Eli Kedori, I don't know how to say this name, taught at the London School of Economics, where Ali Kaddouri became professor of politics. Kaddouri was famous for his rejection of what he called the, quote, Chatham House version, end quote, of history, which viewed the story of the modern Middle East as one of continuous victimization at the hands of the West. Instead, castigated left-wing Western intellectuals for what he regarded as their naively romantic view of Islam. Footnote. See Eliot Kaddouri, Arabic Political Memoirs and Other Studies, published in 1974. And the description for this book says, this book constitutes the continuation and complement of a work, the Chatham House version, and other Middle Eastern studies, published in 1970. Both works are concerned with certain themes prominent in recent Middle Eastern history, namely the influence of great power and particularly British policies in the region, the character of Middle Eastern and particularly Arab politics and political thought during the last 100 years or so, and the fate of so-called minorities, and particularly the Jews of the Arab world, caught as they were in the crossfire of antagonistic ideologies and of international conflict. Back to the text and footnote. New section. At the start of 1937, a report by a British government commission headed by Lord William Robert Peel recommended the partition of Palestine into a small Jewish and a larger Arab state, with Jerusalem being placed under international administration. Wikipedia says William Peel, first Earl Peel, lived from 1867 to 1937. Styles' second Viscount Peel from 1912 to 1929, was a British politician who was a local councillor, a member of Parliament, and a member of the House of Lords. After an early career as a barrister and a journalist, William Peel entered the first local and then national politics. William Peel rose to hold a number of ministerial positions, but is probably best remembered for chairing the Peel Commission in 1936 to 37, which recommended for the first time the partition of the British Mandate of Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states. The grandson of a conservative prime minister, William Peel was unusual even for this period in the number of political parties for which he was elected. He began as a member of the moderate party of the London County Council and later became leader of the renamed Municipal Reform Party. He was then elected as an MP for the Liberal Unionist and then for the Conservative Party, before William Peel inherited his seat in the Lords in 1912. Peel also served as minister in governments led by Liberals, Conservatives, and Labour prime ministers. William Peel's ministerial career began as Under Secretary of State for War in 1919, and William Peel entered the cabinet in 1922 as Secretary of State for India and held a number of other ministerial positions. And the Peel Commission says, the Peel Commission, formerly known as the Palestine Royal Commission, was a British Royal Commission of Inquiry headed by Lord Peel, appointed in 1936 to investigate the causes of conflict in Mandatory Palestine, which was administered by the United Kingdom following a 6-month-long Arab general strike. On the 7th of July 1937, the Commission published a report that for the first time stated that the League of Nations mandate had become unworkable and recommended partition. The British cabinet endorsed the partition plan in principle but requested more information. Following the publication in 1938 The Woodhead Commission was appointed to examine it in detail and recommend an actual partition plan. The Arab leaders opposed the partition plan. The Arab Higher Committee opposed the idea of a Jewish state and called for an independent state of Palestine with, quote, protection of all legitimate Jewish and other minority rights and safeguarding of reasonable British interest, end quote. The Arab Higher Committee also demanded cessation of all Jewish immigration and land purchases. They argued that the creation of a Jewish state and lack of independent Palestine was a betrayal of the word given by Britain. The Zionist leadership was bitterly divided over the plan. In a resolution adopted at the 1937 Zionist Congress, the delegates rejected the specific partition plan. Yet the principle of partition is generally thought to have been, quote, accepted or, quote, not rejected outright, end quote, by any major faction. The delegates empowered the leadership to pursue future negotiations. The Jewish Agency Council later attached a request that a conference be convened to explore a peaceful settlement in terms of an undivided Palestine. According to Benny Morris, Ben-Gurion, and Weizmann, Ben-Gurion and Weizmann saw it, quote, as a stepping stone to some further expansion and the eventual takeover of the whole of Palestine, end quote. And that's from Benny Morris, Righteous Victims, A History of the Zionist-Arab Conflict, 1881 to 2001. I don't know if Benny Morris would say the same thing now. Back to the text. Where am I? This was the first partition plan for Palestine. Although the proposed Jewish state would comprise only some 20% of the territory, the majority of the Zionist movement was prepared to accept it in principle. But how did the Arab side react? Quote, it appears that partition was at first accepted by a considerable section of the Arab governments, end quote. Writes historian Lukasz Hershevitz. Wikipedia says Lukasz Hershevitz, I don't know if I'm saying this right, lived from 1920 to 1993, was a Polish historian, associate professor of the Institute of History, and expert on Middle East and Jewish issues in Central and Eastern Europe. Hershevitz was born in Grodno and left, quote, just before the war, end quote, to study at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Hershevitz studied physics and Arabic as well as history. Hershevitz returned to Poland in 1948. Hershevitz went to work at the Polish Institute of International Affairs, Szkoła Główna Służby Zagraniczna, I don't know if I'm saying that right, which is the main school of foreign service. He earned his doctorate at the Institute of History, pt.1, and began work there in 1954. Back to the text. Footnote. See Lukasz Hershevitz, The Third Reich and the Arab East, published in 1966. The description of this book says, this book, first published in English in 1966, is a comprehensive guide to an analysis of the Third Reich's policy towards the Arab world, based on German archive material, the records of the Nuremberg trials, published collections of American, British, French, German, and Italian documents, and on European and Arabian diaries and memoirs. It provides an essential reading for the history of the region at a key point in time. Back to the text and footnote. However, in Palestine itself, opinion was divided. On one side were the radical forces of the Husseinis, the Mufti at their head, and on the other side were groups that publicly expressed support for the Peel Commission plan, parts of the National Liberation League, and the Palestinian Communist Party, and others, such as the Nashashibi family, who preferred not to proclaim their supportive views in public. Wikipedia says the National Liberation League in Palestine was a political party in Palestine founded in early 1944 by members of the Palestine Communist Party, which had experienced a split between Jewish and Arab members the previous year. Boulos Farah and his followers, and other trade unionists and left-wing intellectuals. The Palestine Communist Party was a political party in the British Mandate of Palestine, formed in 1923 through the merger of the Palestinian Communist Party and the Communist Party of Palestine. In 1924, the party was recognized as the Palestinian section of the Communist International. In its early years, the party was predominantly Jewish but held an anti-Zionist position. That's according to Wikipedia. And the Nashashibi family. Wikipedia says the Nashashibi family is the name of a prominent Palestinian Arabic family based in Jerusalem. After the First World War, during the British period, Raghib al-Nashashibi was mayor of Jerusalem from 1920 to 1934. A branch of the family, al-Hassani, are reputed to have moved to Damascus in Syria. Another minor branch, the Akatan, it is presumed to have been established in Turkey, of the offspring of a major Nashashibi Ottoman officer who withdrew to Turkey after the First World War and the fall of Palestine from Ottoman rule. Little is known about the whereabouts in Egypt of the presumed source of the family. Bracket citation needed, end bracket. Back to the text. Footnote. See Mustafa Kaba's article, Palestinians and the Partition Plan, published in Ruth Gavison's edited volume, The Two-State Solution, the UN Partition Resolution of a Mandatory Palestine, Analysis and Sources. The description for this book says, this timely work, contributed by noted authorities, explains the crucial events in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that led to the UN resolution to partition Palestine into two states on November 29, 1947. The book first analyzed the historical context of UN Resolution 181, including the positions and internal debates of the Jewish and Arab parties and of the international community. It then introduces primary sources related to the resolution, such as protocols, letters, reports, and speeches, some of these published for the first time in English. By combining in-depth analyses with such sources, the book provides a rich and comprehensive overview of the subject from a variety of perspectives. It shows that the arguments for a two-state solution, i.e. a Jewish state along with a Palestinian state, are as relevant today as they were then. Featuring both Israeli and Palestinian points of view, this significant work renews the debate that has shaped and is still shaping the Arab-Israeli conflict. It will be an essential resource for anyone interested in the past and future of Israel and Palestine. Back to the text and footnote. At first, when in the early summer 1937, rumors of the envisaged partition began to spread, the Nashashibis and their National Defense Party, quote, did not conceal their support for the principle of partition, and even organized meetings and used other propaganda means to win public support for partition. This positive attitude also prevailed immediately upon the publication of the Commission's report. In private, two leaders of the party, Raghib al-Nashashibi, and Yaqub Faraj told the HC High Commissioner that they were in favor of the principle of partition. End quote. Footnote. That quote is from Yehoshua, I think that's how you say it, Yehoshua Parath, The Palestinian Arab National Movement from Riots to Rebellion, Volume 2, 1929 to 1939, published in London, 1977. The description of this book says, this book, first published in 1877, continues Yehoshua Parath's book on the Palestinian National Movement from the first volume, The Emergence of the Palestinian Arab National Movement, 1918 to 1929. It examines in exhaustive detail the events in the critical decade leading up to the Second World War. Back to the text. I wanted to look up some people. Raghib al-Nashashibi. Wikipedia says Raghib al-Nashashibi, who lived from 1881 to 1951, was a Palestinian public figure and wealthy landowner during the Ottoman Empire, the British Mandate, and the Jordanian administration. Raghib al-Nashashibi was a member of the Nashashibi clan, one of the most influential families in Palestine, and mayor of Jerusalem from 1920 to 1935. Back to the text. Who was the other name referenced? Yaqub Faraj was a Palestinian political leader during the British colonial period. Yaqub Faraj was deputy mayor of Jerusalem during the 1930s and succeeded Musa Kazem Pasha al-Husseini as head of the Palestine Executive Committee in 1934. Yaqub Faraj was described by historian Walid Khalidi as, quote, doyen of the Palestinian Greek Orthodox community, end quote. Okay, back to the text. However, the Nashashibis pulled back from this position. According to Israeli historian Yehoshua Parath, quote, first of all, strong pressure was exerted on the Nashashibis to identify themselves with the HAC's Higher Arab Committee and reaction. Threats were made on the Hashashibis' lives, and indeed during the summer of 1937, various moderates and Nashashibi supporting notables were assaulted or murdered, end quote. Yehoshua Parat. Wikipedia just says Yehoshua Parat lived from 1938 to 2019 and was a Israeli historian and professor of Middle East history. Back to the text. According to historian Mustafa Kaba, quote, contrary to what has been written in the text dealing with the partition plan, this bracket pro-partition and bracket camp did not include a small minority. The feeling that it was a minority resulted from the fact that the vast majority of this camp chose not to express its positions publicly. End quote. Mustafa Kaba. A crucial reason for this choice was that the Mufti and the Mufti's acolytes not only opposed the plan, but also caused the plan's Arab supporters to fear for their lives. On the 14th of July 1937, the Jerusalem correspondent of the London Times summed up the prevailing mood in Palestine thus, quote, there seems to be little chance that anyone who sees the advantages in it, bracket the partition plan, and bracket, will raise his voice as long as the Mufti of Jerusalem retains his present influential position, ... If the partition scheme goes through, the Mufti's position must inevitably be liquidated, ... Any Arab who makes a conciliatory move or does anything short of rejecting the partition scheme as impossible may expect to find himself denounced as a traitor and exposed to terrorism, ... Thus, from both the Arab and the Jewish side, we see that the Mufti's maintenance in his present position is an obstacle to any consideration of the bracket Peel and bracket report on its merits. End quote. Footnote. British National Archive BNA CO 733/326/5 Partition of Palestine Times 14th of July 1937. End footnote. The picture given in the Times is supported by numerous documents found in the British National Archive. In September 1937, Bernard Joseph complained in a letter to Chaim Weizmann, president of the World Zionist Organization, about, quote, the almost complete terrorization of the Arab sections of the community by the Mufti and the Mufti's entourage, ... One by one, Arab notables who were not of his supporters and who dared express opposition to his wishes, ... had been murdered in cold blood by his terrorist gangsters, ... The situation has by now become so dreadful that the entire Arab community lives in constant dread of these terrorists, ... Unless the all-powerful Mufti is deposed, there is no possible hope of the evolution of an Arab moderate view towards partition. Wikipedia says Dov Joseph was an Israeli statesman. During the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, Dov Yosef was in charge of Jerusalem. Dov Yosef later held ministerial positions in 9 Israeli governments. And Chaim Weizmann. Chaim Weizmann, who lived from 1874 to 1952, was a Russian-born Israeli statesman, biochemist, and Zionist leader who served as president of the Zionist organization and later as the first president of Israel. Chaim Weizmann was elected on the 16th of February 1949 and served until his death in 1952. Chaim Weizmann was instrumental in obtaining the Balfour Declaration of 1917 and convincing the United States government to recognize the newly formed State of Israel in 1948. As a biochemist, Weizmann is considered to be the, quote, father, end quote, of industrial fermentation. Chaim Weizmann developed the acetone-butanol-ethanol fermentation process, which produced acetone and butanol and ethanol through bacterial fermentation. Chaim Weizmann's acetone production method was of great importance in the manufacture of cordite explosive propellants for the British war industry during World War II. Chaim Weizmann founded the Seif Research Institute in Rehovot, later named the Weizmann Institute of Science in his honor, and was instrumental in the establishment of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Back to the text. On September 19th, a report from an Arab informant stated that, quote, terrorism in the country was in full swing. It operated on people's minds not so much through its toll of life, but through the very existence of the terrorist bands and the fear to which they subjected large sections of the Arab people. There was no one left who would dare to raise his head and put up a fight. Nowadays, one did not wait till one received a threatening letter. One roamed the streets to try and find out where a band leader could be found so that one could pay him a ransom even without being called upon to do so and thus ensure one's life, end quote. Footnote, extract from letter Haifa, 16th of September 1937 in the British National Archives. One thing was clear. End footnote. One thing was clear. For the partition plan and so the possibility of a peaceful compromise solution to succeed, Amin al-Husseini had to be deposed. And indeed, the Times article quoted above did not remain without effect. On the 16th of July 1937, Sir Arthur Wauchope, High Commissioner for Palestine, admitted in a letter to the British government that, quote, I do consider that there is some truth that moderate Arabs fear to express their real feeling for fear of reprisals, end quote. Sir Arthur Wauchope. General Sir Arthur Grenfell Wauchope lived from 1874 to 1947 and was a British soldier and colonial administrator. Therefore, quote, I consider that the situation is such that the interest of Palestine, as well as of the government, demand the deportation of the Mufti and his associate, Uni Bey, without delay, end quote. Sir Arthur Wauchope. After getting the green light from London on the 17th of July 1937, the High Commissioner took action. On the day the Mufti's Arab Higher Committee was due to meet at its Jerusalem headquarters at 5 p.m., 2 hours earlier an order was issued for the arrest of the Mufti before he could enter the building. The Mufti was then to be taken to Haifa by plane, where the British cruiser Repulse, that's the name of the cruiser, would be waiting to transport the Mufti al-Husseini to the Seychelles, Seychelles, a group of islands located in the north of Madagascar. The quote, ship will anchor outside breakwater so as to obviate possibility of demonstration on wharf, end quote, reported the Captain John H. Godfrey in a top-secret telegram. The prisoners were to be conveyed from the quayside to the ship in a dinghy. However, al-Husseini was tipped off and the plan failed. Al-Husseini entered his headquarters that afternoon through a back entrance that the British police in Palestine, according to their own self-justificatory account, knew nothing about. While both of the main entrances to the building remained under constant police observation, this back door remained unmonitored, allowing the Mufti to leave the way he had come in. The Mufti fled directly to the mosque quarter of the Temple Mount, where Mufti remained in hiding in the coming months. Now London had to explain away this embarrassing failure. The arrest attempt had not been directed against the Mufti, was the new official version by the British government, but against one of the Mufti's colleagues, whom they had in fact succeeded in arresting. If the Mufti had been arrested on the 14th of July 1937 and held in the Seychelles until 1945, the Middle East might today be a different place. Instead of confrontation, there might have been compromise, and instead of religious fanaticism, interest-based political agreements. In any case, the Mufti succeeded in defeating the first attempt at a two-state solution through the use of anti-Semitism and terror. And it would be the very same Mufti from 1941 onwards who would export Goebbels' Nazi anti-Semitism into the Arab world, and then in 1947 incite the Arabs to go to war against the newly proclaimed State of Israel, thereby torpedoing the second attempt too. New section. Berlin steps in. 1937 was the year when the Nazi leadership began to give active support to the Mufti's policy. At the beginning of that year, two of the Mufti's emissaries met Fritz Grobe, the German envoy in Baghdad. Wikipedia says Fritz Grobe lived from 1886 to 1937 and was a German diplomat during the interwar period and World War II. They explained to him that Britain could only be forced to abandon their partition plan by a, quote, major uprising, end quote. The Nazi leadership. The Nazi leadership... Excuse me. Sorry about that. 1937 was also the year when the Nazi leadership began to give active support to the Mufti's policy. At the beginning of that year, two of the Mufti's emissaries met Fritz Grobe, the German envoy in Baghdad. They explained to him that Britain could only be forced to abandon their partition plan by a, quote, major uprising, end quote. Grobe's report goes on to note that according to the emissaries, quote, Arabs are already preparing this struggle. The only great power that is interested in Arab victory over Palestine's Jews and in which Arabs have complete confidence, is Germany. Supreme Arab Council counts, therefore, on German help, end quote. Groba, Baghdad, 5th of January, 1937. In January 1937, Groba responded evasively to this appeal for help. This changed, however, when the Peel Commission plan became known. At no price would Berlin accept a Jewish state. There is a, quote, German interest in strengthening the Arabs as a counterweight to any such increase in the power of the Jews, end quote, insisted a circular of the 1st of June 1937 from the Nazi foreign minister Konstantin von Neurath. Wikipedia says, Konstantin Hermann Karl Freier von Neurath lived from 1873 to 1956 and was a German politician, diplomat, and convicted Nazi war criminal who served as foreign minister of Germany between 1932 and 1938. Born to a Swabian noble family, Neurath began his diplomatic career in 1901. Neurath fought in World War II and was awarded the Iron Cross for his service. After the war, Neurath served as minister to Denmark, ambassador to Italy, and ambassador to Britain. In 1932, Neurath was appointed foreign minister by Chancellor Franz von Papen, and he continued to hold the post under Adolf Hitler. In the early years of the Nazi regime, Neurath was regarded as playing a key role in Hitler's foreign policy pursuits in undermining the Treaty of Versailles and in territorial expansion in the prelude to World War II. However, he was often averse to Hitler's aims for tactical, not necessarily ideological reasons. That aversion eventually induced Hitler to replace Neurath in 1938 with the more compliant Joachim von Ribbentrop, a fervent Nazi. Neurath served as Reich Protector of Bohemia and Moravia between 1939 and 1943, but Neurath's authority was only nominal after September 1941. Neurath was tried as a war criminal at the Nuremberg trials and was sentenced to 15 years in prison for his compliance and actions in Nazi Germany. Neurath received an early release in 1954 and then retired to his family estate, where he died 2 years later. End footnote. All right, back to the text. It is only partially possible to reconstruct the precise scale and type of German support for the, quote, major uprising, end quote, that began in April 1936 and flared up again in summer 1937. The Arab archives remain unavailable, and most of the relevant German records went up in flames in 1945, including the bulk of the records of the propaganda ministry and those of the German embassy in Cairo from 1933 to 1939. In the German Foreign Office archives, it came upon the following handwritten note, quote, report of 4/9/37, or the 4th of September 1947, number 1669, regarding Syrian support for a new Arab uprising in Palestine, and telegram concerning this of the 4th of September 1937 are located in the records marked, quote, Geheim, quote, Geheim, end quote, bracket, quote, secret, end quote, and bracket, end quote. The secret records themselves, however, were not to be found. In the pre-war years, contacts between Nazi agents and the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, the most important country in the region, were also top secret. Egypt was the birthplace of Hitler's henchman, Rudolf Hess, whose family had resided in Alexandria since 1865. In 1926, Rudolf Hess's brother, Alfred, had begun to organize an Egyptian section of the Nazi Foreign Organization. Not really seeing much on anything on Alfred Hess. Let me see if there's anything on German Wikipedia. Alfred Hess lived from 1897 to 1963 and was a German official of the NSDAP/AO, and which was the foreign and brother of Hitler's deputy Rudolf Hess. Wikipedia says from 1924, Alfred Hess lived in Alexandria again, where Alfred Hess worked in his parents' company. From 1926, he also worked on building up the NSDAP in Egypt. In June 1927, he took over management of the Cairo branch of Hess & Co., a company still run by his father. In 1933, he founded the party's regional group in Cairo and became its first head. He built up the Foreign Trade Office in Berlin for the NSDAP/AO, and despite his health being seriously compromised by the war, was a fanatical National Socialist and committed himself to this organization. In 1934, he became deputy head of the NSDAP/AO under Gauleiter Ernst Wilhelm Bolle. After the outbreak of the Second World War, it was planned that he would become Governor General of Egypt after the, quote, final victory, end quote. After Rudolf Hess's, quote, flight to England, end quote, in May 1941, his brother was immediately suspended from his position as deputy leader of the NSDAP/AO and taken into custody. After the end of the war, Hess was interned in the United States and was questioned as a witness for the defense of the Nuremberg trials of the major war criminals. Alfred Hess was subsequently denazified after a denazification trial and released from internment. Anyway, back to the text. Until the beginning of the war in September 1939, the Muslim Brotherhood's propaganda efforts were supported by the German embassy in Cairo, the Deutsche Nachrichtenbüro, a department of the Nazi propaganda ministry with a broad remit. The Deutsche Nachrichtenbüro furnished the Brotherhood with funds according to records found in the home of Wilhelm Stellbogen, the head of the Deutsche Nachrichtenbüro office in Egypt. According to Wikipedia, the German news agency is what that stands for. DNB means. The Deutsches Nachrichtenbüro GmbH was the official central press agency of the German Reich during the Nazi era. Back to the text. Wilhelm Stellbogen. Not seeing anything. It was no accident that the Nazis considered the Muslim Brotherhood founded by Hassan al-Banna in 1928 as a natural partner. Al-Banna had already in 1927 established ties with Amin al-Husseini and given unreserved support in Egypt to his anti-Semitic campaigns. In 1936, the Muslim Brotherhood had called for a boycott of the businesses of Egyptian Jews between 1936 and 1938 as a result of their Palestine campaign. Membership of the Brotherhood had risen from 80 to 200,000. Footnote: see Abd al-Fattah al-Awizi, The Muslim Brothers and the Palestine Question, 1928 to 1947, published in 1996. The description for this book says, founded in 1928 in Egypt and still an important factor in Middle Eastern politics, the Muslim Brothers Society was a precursor of contemporary Islamist movements in the Arab world. The book presents a detailed history of the Muslim Brotherhood's involvement in the Palestine question, an episode that was equally significant both for its own development and for the subsequent and in recent years dramatic growth of the Islamic element in Palestinian politics. Using a wide range of documentary sources supplemented by interviews, the author provides an account of the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood, the evolution of the Muslim Brotherhood's organizational structure, and the various means by which the Muslim Brotherhood disseminated its message. Back to the text and footnote. By 1945, it had become the most influential mass movement and most important purveyor of Islamic antisemitism in the Arab world. The Brotherhood's collaboration with Nazi agents came to light by chance. Immediately before the outbreak of World War II, the Cairo Nazis had had to make a hasty departure from their premises in the city, leaving behind papers that fell into the hands of British secret services. Even the few clues retrieved from the search of the premises revealed cooperation on a level previously unsuspected by the British. They showed that the Brotherhood had received funds from Nazi sources, quote, which were considerably larger than the subsidies offered to other anti-British activists, end quote, wrote Islam scholar Brynjar Leah. Quote, these transfers appear to have been coordinated by Haj Amin al-Husseini and some of his Palestinian contacts in Cairo, end quote. Brynjar Leah is a Norwegian historian, or it's maybe Brynjar Leah, is a Norwegian historian and professor of Middle East Studies at the Department of Cultural Studies and Oriental Languages at the University of Oslo. Brynjar Leah is also an adjunct research professor at the Norwegian Defense Research Establishment, FFI, where he headed FFI's research on international terrorism and global jihadism between 1999 and 2011. Brynjar Leah is viewed as one of Norway's foremost experts on terrorism and is much cited in Norwegian and international media in connection to Al-Qaeda and international terrorism. Brynjar Leah's last book is about Abu Musab al-Suri, which has been reviewed in publications like Newsweek, The Economist, London Review of Books, and the New York Review of Books. Back to the text, footnote. Brynjar Leah, the Society of the Muslim Brothers in Egypt. The description of this book says provides an understanding of the influence of contemporary Islamism by presenting the history of the meteoric rise of the mother organization of all Islamist movements, the Society of the Muslim Brothers. This book examines the socioeconomic and cultural factors which facilitated the movement's expansion. Back to the text and footnote. The 30-page report titled Notes on German Suspects, Egypt, which I discovered in March 2016 in the British National Archives, reveals that Nazi agents attended conferences of the Muslim Brotherhood. The German officials held, quote, Palestine meetings, end quote, with the Brotherhood, and that they also discussed the issue directly with Hassan al-Banna. The fact that the collaboration with the Brotherhood was known about at the highest levels in Germany is clear from the following note dated 16th of August, found by British Secret Services in Wilhelm Stellbogen's Cairo residence. Quote, further advance payments to the Muslim Brotherhood are, in my opinion, very necessary because these people can do very much. An immediate connection with Berlin through the legation should be started and more funds asked for. The conversation with HB, bracket Hassan al-Banna, end bracket, about the P, bracket Palestine, end bracket, question, is very satisfactory, and likewise, GOEB, bracket Goebbels, end bracket, has spoken about it with much praise, end quote. The British source adds, quote, note, year not stated but possibly 1938, end parenthesis, end quote. A certain Walter Uppenkamp, described as, quote, training officer, end quote, of the local branch of the Nazi Party in Cairo, invited Egyptians and especially Brotherhood members to lectures on the, quote, Jewish question, end quote, while Ernst Engelmann, deputy chairman of the branch, in notes on German-Egyptian cooperation in the preparation of bomb attacks in Palestine, reported that, quote, the last 200 kilos of chlorate have been delivered to Helwan, bracket, a suburb of Cairo, end bracket. We have ourselves advised that instead of making explosives here, young chemists should be trained for such manufacture and should be sent to Palestine. So far, several have left already. The expenses have been paid by the Arabs. We have been asked to assist regulate the meetings of the Muslim Brethren, end quote. Ernst Engelmann. In Palestine itself, the Nazis also sought to fan the flames of anti-Jewish and anti-British revolt. German assistance was not confined to advice and encouragement. German assistance also involved supplies of arms and large-scale funding. Quote, the Mufti has asked me to convey sincere thanks for the support so far provided, end quote. We read in speaking notes for Admiral Wilhelm Canaris of June 1939. Wikipedia says Wilhelm Canaris lived from 1887 to 1945 and was a German admiral. During the Nazi era, William Wilhelm Canaris was head of the Abwehr, the Wehrmacht's military intelligence service, from 1935 to 1944. Canaris, who came from a middle-class family, served in the First World War as an agent and submarine commander, among other things. During the Weimar Republic, Wilhelm Canaris worked closely with the Freikorps to combat the Spartacists and later maintained a legal contact with the nationalist, anti-Semitic, and anti-Republican terrorist organization Council. Wilhelm Canaris played a key role in organizing German support for Franco in the Spanish Civil War. As head of intelligence, Wilhelm Canaris was involved in all major military operations of the German Reich in the Second World War until the beginning of 1944. In 1944, Wilhelm Canaris was dismissed as chief of the Abwehr. From 1938 onwards, Wilhelm Canaris supported numerous conservative resistance fighters and was involved in coup plans between 1938 and 1940. Wilhelm Canaris was not directly involved in the assassination attempt on Hitler on July 20th, 1940. During investigations by the secret state police, Canaris' diary was found and his contact with the resistance against National Socialism was revealed. As a result, Canaris was arrested. At the beginning of April 1945, Wilhelm Canaris was sentenced to death and hanged by an SS court-martial in the Flossenburg concentration camp. Back to the text. Quote, "The Mufti has asked me to convey his sincere thanks for the support so far provided," end quote. We read in speaking notes for Admiral Wilhelm Canaris of June 1939, quote, "Only through the funds we provided was he able to go ahead with the uprising in Palestine," end quote. Canaris was head of the German military intelligence organization, the Abwehr. The note was written by a subordinate officer, Oberst Hans Piekenbrock, head of military foreign espionage. A remark to the effect that, quote, "funds have been provided for the victims of the uprising," end quote, shows how deeply the Abwehr, which reported directly to the Wehrmacht's high command, was involved in pre-war Palestine. Footnote. See the book Klaus Michael Malmann and Morten Kupper's Hauptmann und Hakenkreuz, Das Dritte Reich, die Abel und Palästina. I already looked this up. I think I might have looked this up already. Yes, I did. End footnote. I'm going to look up the Abwehr. Wikipedia says the Abwehr, German for resistance or defense, though the word usually means counterintelligence in a military context, was the German military intelligence service for the Reichswehr and the Wehrmacht from 1920 to 1944. Although the 1919 Treaty of Versailles prohibited the Weimar Republic from establishing an intelligence organization of their own, they formed an espionage group in 1920 within the Ministry of Defense, calling it the Abwehr. The initial purpose of the Abwehr was defense against foreign espionage, an organizational role that later evolved considerably. Under General Kurt von Schleicher, prominent in running the Reichswehr from 1926 onwards, the individual military services intelligence units were combined, and in 1929 centralized under Schleicher's Ministeramt, within the Ministry of Defense, forming the foundation for the more commonly understood manifestation of the Abwehr. Each Abwehr station throughout Germany was based on the local army district, Wehrkreis. More offices opened in amenable neutral countries and, as the Greater Reich expanded, in the occupied territories. On the 4th of February 1938, the Ministry of Defense, renamed the Ministry of War in 1935, was dissolved and became the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, with Hitler in direct command. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht formed part of the Führer's personal, quote, working staff, end quote, from June 1938, and the Abwehr became its intelligence agency under Vice Admiral Wilhelm Canaris. The Abwehr had its headquarters at 76/78 Tirpitz Ufer, the present-day Reich Piet-Schufer in Berlin, adjacent to the offices of the OKW, or the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. Back to the text. In a British War Office file entitled German Nazi Activities in Palestine, October 38th to October 39, there's a reference to German assistance in the production of explosive devices, apparently a firm run by, quote, Palestinian Germans, end quote, members of the German minority in Palestine, was used for bomb making. In March 1939, the premature ignition of a bomb on the firm's premises had killed an Arab employee and seriously wounded another. In May 1939, the British authorities expelled a certain Oscar Dietrich from the territory. He was accused of having joined the insurgents and served as their specialist in the manufacture of landmines. Ferdinand Zeiler, the German consul general in Beirut, how do you say that? Beirut, Lebanon? I always feel like Beirut, Lebanon. Sound like a dumbass. Anyway, Ferdinand Zeiler, the German consul in Beirut, also among those Nazi functionaries who in these pre-war days sought to promote terrorism against Jews and Britons. One second. Ferdinand Zeiler, the German consul general in Beirut, was among those Nazi functionaries who in these pre-war days sought to promote terrorism against Jews and Britons. In September 1937, Ferdinand Zeiler wrote in relation to thwarting the Peel Plan, quote, the only way to achieve this seemed and seems to me to lie in the effort by the Arabs to use terrorism to intimidate the Jews and at the same time put pressure on the English, end quote. Ferdinand Zeiler. How close the ties between German officialdom and the leadership of the uprising were is shown by a telegram from Zeiler of October 1937, quote, agents give notice, terror action, Amman, Transjordan, Friday, aim relief, Palestine front, end quote. Here, the German consul general is being informed in advance about a terrorist action. In retrospect, the disastrous consequence of the frustration of the Peel Plan are clear. Quote, for had a Jewish state been created in 1937, even a small part of Palestine, it could have saved the lives of hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of those unfortunate Jews who later perished in the Holocaust. End quote. Footnote. See Avi Shleim, The Politics of Partition, King Abdullah the Zionist in Palestine, 1921 to 1951. In this reissue of the abridged paperback edition of his critically acclaimed Collusion Across the Jordan, Professor Avi Shleim chronicles King Abdullah's relations with the Zionist movement from his appointment as Emir of Transjordan in 1921 to his assassination in 1951, with a new introduction placing the book in the wider context of ongoing debate about 1948. This masterly and authoritative study is essential reading for all those interested in the politics of the Middle East. Back to the text and footnote. Although by the start of 1938 the Peel Plan was a lost cause, the Nazis still sought to sustain the unrest. The reason for this was provided by Alfred Rosenberg, head of the NSDAP's Foreign Policy Office. Quote, the longer the fire burns in Palestine, Alfred Rosenberg prophesied in December 1938, quote, the stronger becomes the opposition to the Jewish regime of violence in all the Arab states and moreover also in the other Muslim countries, end quote. Alfred Rosenberg. Wikipedia says Alfred Rosenberg lived from 1893 to 1946 and was a Baltic German Nazi theorist and ideologue. Rosenberg was first introduced to Adolf Hitler by Dietrich Eckart, and he held several important posts in the Nazi government. Alfred Rosenberg was the head of the NSDAP Office of Foreign Affairs during the entire rule of Nazi Germany from 1933 to 1945, and led Amt Rosenberg's Bureau, an official Nazi body for cultural policy and surveillance, between 1934 and 1945. During World War II, Alfred Rosenberg was the head of the Reich Ministry for Occupied Eastern Territories, 1941 to 45. Alfred Rosenberg helped direct the extermination of the Slavs. After the war, he was convicted of crimes against peace, planning, initiating, and waging wars of aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity at the Nuremberg trials in 1946. He was sentenced to death by hanging and executed on the 16th of October 1946. The author of a seminal work of Nazi ideology, The Myth of the 20th Century, Rosenberg is considered one of the main authors of key Nazi ideological creeds, including Nazism's racial theory and its hatred of the Jewish people, the need for Lebensraum, abrogation of the Treaty of Versailles, and opposition to what was considered, quote, degenerate, end quote, modern art. He was also known for his hatred and rejection of what he regarded as, quote, negative, end quote, Christianity. However, Alfred Rosenberg played an important role in the development of the German nationalist positive Christianity, which denied that Jesus is the Messiah and rejected the Old Testament. Back to the text. As later events were to show, not only the Nazis, but also Amin al-Husseini attached great importance to the internationalization of anti-Semitism. In the evening of the 16th of July, 1937, the eve of the failed attempt to arrest him, al-Husseini had a conversation with Walter Döhler, a German consul general in Jerusalem. One second. Yeah, there's a weird thing in that. Sorry, I had a thought while I was reading the Rosenberg thing. He said the extermination of the Slavs. I'm going to read the German version of the Alfred Rosenberg Wikipedia. Alfred Rosenberg was a politician during the Weimar Republic and National Socialism and a leading ideologist of the Nazi Party as well as a war criminal. As a student, Alfred Rosenberg witnessed the 1917 revolution in Moscow. Under the influence of Russian emigres, he interpreted it as the result of a Jewish Masonic world conspiracy. With this idea, Alfred Rosenberg later significantly shaped the ideology of the Nazi Party. From 1920 onward, Alfred Rosenberg contributed significantly to the intensification of anti-Semitism in Germany and his numerous racially ideological writings. During World War II, Alfred Rosenberg and his Einsatz Reichsleiter Rosenberg undertook raids throughout Europe, particularly the looting of cultural property. As Reich Minister of the occupied Eastern Territories, he pursued the project of Germanizing the occupied Eastern Territories while systematically exterminating the Jews as part of his Eastern policy. Rosenberg was indicted at the Nuremberg trials of the major war criminals, found guilty in all 4 counts, sentenced to death and executed. Back to the text. It is not known whether it was the consul general who tipped the Mufti off about the arrest attempt. However, we do know that the Mufti remained in contact with Walter Döhler through intermediaries while in hiding in the mosque quarter of the Temple Mount. Moreover, it was in this period that al-Husseini was directing operations from his refuge that a pamphlet entitled Islam and Judaism was published. This document might well be considered the founding text of Islamic antisemitism. Yeah, I don't have that. I'm looking for the if there's any description just in general of Islam and Judaism by al-Husseini. I'm not really seeing one. It is available online, though. Anyway, I think I'm going to cut the video in half here. It seems to make sense.